The tremors you're feeling in global energy markets aren't coming from Wall Street boardrooms or Middle Eastern oil fields. They're emanating from the red earth of Burkina Faso, the gold mines of Mali, and the uranium deposits of Niger. What you're witnessing is nothing short of a continental awakening, a resource rebellion that's sending shockwaves through European capitals and fundamentally reshaping the architecture of global power. For too long, the narrative around African resources has been written by external voices, painting a picture of inevitability around exploitation and dependency. But today, we're witnessing something extraordinary, a generation of African leaders who refuse to accept that their continent's vast wealth should flow outward while their people remain impoverished. This isn't about rhetoric or revolutionary posturing. This is about concrete actions that are already transforming markets, challenging assumptions, and forcing the world to reckon with African agency. At the epicenter of this transformation stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a leader whose vision extends far beyond his nation's borders. At just 34 years old, Traoré represents something that terrifies neo-colonial architects, an African leader who combines strategic acumen with unwavering commitment to his people's sovereignty. His approach isn't rooted in anti-Western sentiment, but in pro-African pragmatism, a distinction that Western media consistently fails to grasp or deliberately obscures. The numbers tell a story that no amount of Western propaganda can distort. Niger alone supplies approximately 15% of the uranium that powers European nuclear reactors. Mali's gold production has historically flowed through channels that benefit everyone except Malians. Burkina Faso's mineral wealth has enriched foreign corporations while its citizens struggle with basic infrastructure needs. This mathematical absurdity, where the source of wealth remains impoverished, is precisely what leaders like Traoré are dismantling. When Traoré and his allies began demanding fair partnerships rather than extractive relationships, European energy companies initially dismissed these moves as temporary disruptions. They had grown comfortable with decades of predictable extraction, where African resources were treated as extensions of European strategic reserves. The audacity of African leaders asserting control over their own natural wealth caught these corporations fundamentally unprepared. Consider the cascade effect we're witnessing across energy markets. As West African nations reclaim sovereignty over their uranium resources, European utilities are scrambling to secure alternative supplies. The spot price of uranium has experienced unprecedented volatility, not because of scarcity, but because of sovereignty. African nations are no longer content to be price takers in markets built on their own resources. This shift represents more than economic repositioning. It embodies a philosophical revolution in how Africa engages with the global economy. Previous generations of African leaders often accepted the false binary between isolation and exploitation. Today's sovereignty movement, exemplified by leaders like Traoré, rejects this paradigm entirely. They're demonstrating that African nations can engage globally while maintaining control over their strategic assets. The European response has been predictably defensive, mixing paternalistic concern trolling with barely concealed economic anxiety. European officials suddenly discovered deep concerns about democracy and human rights precisely when African leaders begin asserting economic sovereignty. This transparent hypocrisy hasn't escaped the notice of African populations, particularly the youth who comprise the majority of the continent's demographic. African youth understand what their parents' generation sometimes struggled to articulate, that true sovereignty cannot coexist with economic subjugation. When Traoré speaks about transforming Burkina Faso's economy to serve Burkinabés first, young Africans across the continent recognize their own aspirations reflected in his vision. This generational alignment between leadership and population creates a political foundation that foreign interference struggles to undermine. The media narrative surrounding these developments reveals the extent to which Western outlets remain trapped in colonial frameworks of analysis. Reports consistently frame African sovereignty movements through the lens of geopolitical competition between external powers, as if African agency exists only as a function of great power rivalry. This analytical framework fundamentally misunderstands what's happening. African leaders aren't choosing between Western and Eastern influence, they're choosing African interests. When Traoré expelled French forces from Burkina Faso, Western media portrayed this as evidence of Russian influence rather than recognizing it as a logical response to France's historical exploitation of Burkina resources. The inability to conceive of African decisions as expressions of African strategic thinking reveals the persistent colonial mentality that still shapes European perceptions of the continent. The economic implications extend far beyond individual resource transactions. What we're witnessing is the emergence of a new African economic nationalism that prioritizes value addition and local beneficiation over raw material export. Leaders like Traoré understand that shipping gold ore to European refineries while importing finished jewelry represents the essence of colonial economics. Their push for local processing facilities and indigenous value chains threatens the entire architecture of neo-extractive relationships. This transformation isn't occurring in isolation. It's part of a broader Pan-African consciousness that connects sovereignty movements across the continent. The alliance of Sahel states, linking Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, represents something unprecedented. African nations coordinating their resource policies to maximize collective leverage. This regional integration based on shared sovereignty principles creates synergies that amplify individual national efforts. The ripple effects are already visible in commodity markets beyond uranium. European companies that built business models around guaranteed access to African gold, diamonds, and other minerals are discovering that those guarantees were never legitimate. They were products of political arrangements that served everyone except African populations. As more leaders adopt Traoré-style sovereignty principles, these companies face the uncomfortable reality of negotiating fair partnerships rather than extractive concessions. European energy security, long taken for granted, now depends on adapting to African sovereignty rather than circumventing it. The era when European capitals could engineer regime change to protect resource access is rapidly ending, not because of military constraints, but because African populations increasingly understand and support sovereignty-oriented leadership. The psychological dimension of this transformation cannot be understated. For generations, African political discourse was dominated by leaders who apologized for African capacity and deferred to European expertise. Leaders like Traoré represent a fundamentally different archetype, African leaders who assume African competence and demand European respect. This shift in posture creates political space for policies that would have been unthinkable under previous paradigms. The economic data emerging from sovereignty-focused nations challenges every assumption about African development. Despite facing sanctions and international pressure, countries that prioritize resource sovereignty are experiencing improvements in social indicators and infrastructure development. This empirical evidence undermines the Western narrative that African prosperity requires European partnership on European terms. What makes this resource rebellion particularly effective is its grounding in legitimate popular support. Unlike previous African leaders who relied on external backing to maintain power, sovereignty-oriented leaders like Traoré derive their authority from demonstrable commitment to national interests. This domestic legitimacy provides resilience against external pressure and creates sustainable foundations for long-term transformation. The technological dimension adds another layer of complexity to this resource rebellion. African nations are increasingly leveraging digital platforms and modern communication technologies to bypass traditional Western media filters and speak directly to global audiences. When Traoré addresses his nation or the world, his words reach African diaspora communities, progressive activists, and policy observers without Western editorial interpretation. This direct communication capability undermines traditional information asymmetries that favored Western perspectives. European energy companies are now confronting a reality they never prepared for, negotiating with African leaders who understand their own leverage and refuse to accept disadvantageous terms. The comfortable assumption that African desperation would always guarantee European advantage has proven catastrophically wrong. African leaders who prioritize sovereignty over approval are discovering they possess more economic leverage than decades of Western conditioning led them to believe. The regional security implications extend beyond economic considerations. As sovereignty-oriented governments demonstrate their capacity to deliver tangible improvements in citizens' lives, they undermine the appeal of extremist organizations that thrive on governance failures. Effective African leadership that serves African interests provides the most sustainable foundation for regional stability. Looking ahead, the trends are unmistakable. More African nations are studying the Traoré model and adapting sovereignty principles to their specific circumstances. The continental consensus around resource sovereignty is building momentum that will prove increasingly difficult for external actors to reverse. European energy markets will need to adapt to a new reality where African resources are controlled by African governments accountable to African populations. The generational aspect of this transformation ensures its persistence. Young Africans who witness leaders like Traoré successfully asserting sovereignty while delivering concrete improvements in national conditions are unlikely to accept a return to previous patterns of external domination. This creates a ratchet effect where each successful assertion of sovereignty raises expectations and expands possibilities for future leaders. The implications for global power structures are profound. The assumption that European and American economic dominance was permanent reflected not inherent superiority, but temporary historical circumstances. As African nations reclaim control over their resources and redirect their wealth toward domestic development, the global balance of economic power will inevitably shift toward greater multipolarity. This resource rebellion represents more than economic policy. It embodies a fundamental assertion of African dignity and agency. Leaders like Traoré are demonstrating that African nations need not choose between prosperity and sovereignty. They can achieve both through strategic thinking, popular support, and unwavering commitment to national interests. The European energy crisis emerging from African resource sovereignty is ultimately a crisis of adjustment. European economies built on guaranteed access to underpriced African resources must now adapt to fair market relationships with sovereign African partners. This transition may prove uncomfortable for European consumers and businesses, but it represents a necessary correction of historical inequities. What we're witnessing is the emergence of Africa as a continent of partners rather than dependencies, of strategic actors rather than passive suppliers. The resource rebellion led by visionaries like Ibrahim Traoré is crashing European energy markets not through destructive intent, but through the constructive assertion of African interests. This transformation is inevitable because it is just. No external force can permanently suppress the legitimate aspirations of African populations for sovereignty over their resources and self-determination of their future. The current wave of resource rebellion represents the natural maturation of African political consciousness and the healthy assertion of continental agency. The question facing the international community is not whether this transformation will continue, it will, but whether global powers will adapt to African sovereignty with grace or resist it with increasingly desperate measures. The most constructive path forward involves recognizing African agency, respecting African decisions, and building genuine partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than historical privilege. If you believe in African sovereignty and want to support content that celebrates authentic African leadership, hit that like button right now. This channel exists to amplify African voices and challenge the narratives that keep our continent subjugated. Subscribe and ring that notification bell to stay updated on the latest developments in Africa's sovereignty movement. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand that the future belongs to nations brave enough to claim their sovereignty, and that future is being written by leaders like Ibrahim Traoré who refuse to compromise African interests for foreign approval. Your engagement with this content directly supports the broader movement for African consciousness and sovereignty. Every like, every share, every subscription tells the algorithm that African perspectives matter and deserve amplification. Together, we're not just watching history, we're participating in the renaissance of African agency and the inevitable rise of a continent that will no longer accept anything less than dignity, respect, and sovereignty over its own destiny.